From the moment Daniel entered their life, he was unforgettable. His laugh could brighten even the darkest days, and his kindness seemed boundless. They first met as children, brought together by their families in the small, comforting routines of Sunday school. Over time, their lives became more intertwined, from neighborhood games to shared birthday parties, school events, and holiday traditions. Daniel wasn't just a friend. He was the kind of person who left an impression long after he was gone. A soul so radiant, it seemed to pull others toward him effortlessly. Even as a child, Daniel had a way of standing out. He was the one who would volunteer to help clean up after a group activity or notice when someone felt left out, always stepping in with his disarming smile. The narrator recalls how, even then, they were drawn to him. It wasn't romantic at first, just the simple joy of being near someone who felt like a beacon of light. He made them laugh with his goofy impressions, and he had a knack for turning ordinary moments into something memorable. By the time they reached 6th grade, things began to shift. Daniel was no longer just the boy who made them laugh. He was the boy who made their hearts skip a beat. They couldn't quite name the feeling back then, just that there was something different about the way they noticed him, something warm and thrilling. They started looking forward to moments when their paths would cross. A quick conversation before class, a shared laugh at lunch, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. High school brought them even closer. Their friendship grew stronger, built on years of shared history and the kind of trust that only comes from truly knowing someone. But along with it came the realization that this was something deeper than friendship. The narrator began to see Daniel in a new light, not just as a companion, but as someone who made their world feel complete. Every joke, every kind word, every glance seemed to carry more weight. Slowly, their bond transformed into a love that felt unshakable, as if it had been waiting for them all along. Daniel was more than a first love. He was a foundation. They were best friends, confidants, and partners who shared not only their present, but their dreams for the future. He had an unshakable optimism that made anything feel possible. And with him, the narrator dared to imagine a life filled with joy and promise. Together, they envisioned everything from their wedding day to the names of their future children, at planning a future they believed was inevitable. It was a connection so rare, so profound, that the narrator couldn't imagine a world where Daniel wasn't at the center of it. Their relationship was nothing short of extraordinary, a storybook romance that unfolded in real life. From the moment their feelings for each other deepened in high school, it was as if they were building a world that only they could share. Daniel was the narrator's first love, and they were his. Together, they learned what it meant to truly trust someone, to be vulnerable, and to grow not just as individuals, but as a couple. It wasn't just about love, it was about partnership. They were each other's anchors, their biggest cheerleaders, and their safest places. High school was filled with milestones, homecoming dances, late-night phone calls, and endless conversations about their dreams for the future. Even in the chaotic whirl of teenage life, Daniel and the narrator found a steady rhythm together. They had inside jokes that no one else understood, secret spots where they'd escape to talk for hours, and a sense of connection that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. It wasn't just young love. It was the kind of bond that felt unshakable, built on years of knowing each other's hearts better than anyone else. When it came time to leave for college, there was no question that they'd stick together. The challenges of balancing school, work, and long distance didn't shake them. If anything, it only solidified their commitment. They supported each other through late-night study sessions, celebrated each other's wins, and comforted each other during hard times. They weren't just romantic partners. They were teammates, working toward a shared vision of their future. Together, they dreamed big. Marriage was a certainty, not a question. They planned their wedding in vivid detail, imagining every moment down to the music that would play as they walked down the aisle. They talked about the house they'd one day buy, the careers they'd build, and the children they'd raise. They even had names picked out for their future kids, each one chosen with care and love. They spoke about their life ahead with the kind of optimism that only comes when you're absolutely certain of the person by your side. Every moment they shared felt significant. From lazy Sundays watching movies to spontaneous road trips, Their time together was filled with laughter, affection, and the kind of passion that made even the simplest gestures, like holding hands or stealing a kiss, feel monumental. Daniel had a way of making the narrator feel seen, cherished, and understood in a way no one else ever had. It was a love that seemed untouchable, a connection so pure that the thought of anything coming between them felt impossible. But despite the seemingly perfect life they had built together, something inside the narrator began to shift, a subtle crack in the foundation they had worked so hard to create. It wasn't something they had intended or expected. The affair didn't begin with a single impulsive decision or a drunken mistake. It was far more insidious than that. At first, it was just a fleeting connection, an unexpected bond that seemed harmless at first. But like a small spark in dry grass, it slowly started to grow until it became something the narrator could no longer ignore. It began innocently enough. A few extra conversations, a couple of shared moments with someone who made them feel seen in a way they hadn't realized they were missing. It was easy to dismiss at first, a brief distraction from the closeness they had with Daniel. But as time went on, the connection deepened. There was something about this other man, someone the narrator had never truly considered a threat, that filled a void they hadn't even recognized was there. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a casual flirtation, nothing that could possibly compare to the love they had for Daniel. But the more they engaged, the more they found themselves drawn in, and the guilt that had once been a whisper grew louder, silencing their better judgment. In hindsight, they could see how foolish they had been. This man, the one they had chosen to open up to emotionally, the one they had allowed into the deepest parts of their heart, was in no way, shape, or form even close to Daniel. He didn't have the kindness, the charisma, or the unwavering loyalty that Daniel possessed. He wasn't funny, he wasn't thoughtful, and he wasn't the person who could make them feel safe the way Daniel had. And yet, they kept going back. They began spending more time with him, allowing the emotional bond to deepen into something physical, something that was never just a mistake, but a betrayal of the most painful kind. The narrator had convinced themselves that it was just one mistake, one lapse in judgment, a moment of weakness they could easily dismiss and forget. But it wasn't. It wasn't just a single slip-up. It was a prolonged period of dishonesty and emotional disconnection from the person they had promised to love forever. The affair was not only physical, it was emotional. And that, they would come to realize, was the most dangerous part. They had allowed themselves to fall into something they couldn't control, something that was slowly eroding the trust that had taken years to build. Every time the narrator returned to Daniel after a moment with this other man, they felt a crushing weight of guilt, knowing they were lying, knowing they were betraying the love that had once felt so pure and unwavering. But the temptation of the other connection, the way it made them feel desired, noticed, and appreciated, was intoxicating. The narrator tells themselves they never meant to hurt Daniel, that they never meant for this affair to grow into something that could destroy everything they had. But the truth was, they had let their guard down. They hadn't even realized how dangerous it was to let their heart wander, to allow an emotional connection with someone else to bloom in the shadows of their marriage. And it wasn't until it was too late, until the affair had become something undeniable, that the narrator realized just how fragile everything had been. The love they had taken for granted, the trust they had assumed was unbreakable, was now shattered, and it was all their fault. What had once felt like an insignificant dalliance had transformed into a betrayal of the most catastrophic kind. And as much as they tried to justify their actions, the reality was harsh. They had chosen someone else over the one person who had loved them without question, without hesitation. When Daniel found out, everything came crashing down. The moment of discovery was unlike anything the narrator could have prepared for. It didn't happen in some dramatic, tear-filled confrontation. No, it was far worse. It was quiet. Too quiet. Daniel, with his ever-present calm and kind nature, had always been the one who steadied their world. But when the truth finally reached him, the shift in him was palpable. His eyes, which had always reflected warmth and trust, suddenly seemed distant, like someone had turned off the light behind them. The confrontation was brief, sharp, and devastating. There were no wild accusations, no shouting or drama. Daniel, always composed, simply looked at the narrator with a sadness that cut deeper than any words could. The silence between them spoke volumes. He asked questions that the narrator couldn't answer truthfully, couldn't bear to look him in the eye and lie anymore. He didn't need to hear the details, and the narrator couldn't bring themselves to offer them. The damage was already done. And then, without a word, Daniel walked away. He didn't scream, he didn't demand anything. He just left, disappearing from the narrator's life in an instant. There was no closure, no chance to explain, no opportunity to apologize. Daniel's departure was like a final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been slowly building toward this moment for months, maybe even years. The finality of it all hit the narrator harder than they could have imagined. It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath their feet, leaving them to sink into the unbearable weight of their actions. For the next few days, the narrator tried everything they could think of to reach out to Daniel. Their calls went unanswered, their texts read and ignored. They sent email after email, each one filled with apologies, with pleas for forgiveness, with the raw, gut-wrenching realization of what they had done. They tried to explain, tried to tell him how sorry they were, how much they wished they could take everything back, but nothing reached him. Every effort was met with deafening silence. Desperation began to creep in. The narrator couldn't stop thinking about the emptiness in Daniel's absence. It was as if a piece of their soul had been ripped out, leaving them hollow. They tried to get advice from friends, hoping for some guidance, but all they heard were words that didn't seem to matter anymore. Give him space, they were told. He needs time. But time felt like the cruelest thing of all. Every second without hearing from Daniel felt like an eternity. 2 nights later, just when the narrator thought they couldn't feel any lower, the universe dealt the final blow. It was 3:17 a.m. when they were woken by a loud, insistent knock on the door. At first, they thought it was just someone from a party, perhaps a neighbor coming to complain about the noise. But when they opened the door, they were met by 2 police officers. The sight of them standing there, their faces grim, instantly sent a jolt of fear through the narrator's chest. "Are you the partner of Daniel Carter?" one of the officers asked, his voice even but filled with something darker beneath the surface. Before the narrator could respond, the officer continued, "We regret to inform you that Daniel is deceased. He has been found dead in what appears to be a suicide." The world tilted. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vanish as the weight of the words sank in. For a moment, they couldn't breathe. The words didn't seem real, couldn't be real. They wanted to scream, to deny it, to ask for more details, but the words were stuck in their throat. The reality of it was too much. In a panic, the narrator collapsed. They dropped to their knees, wailing in a way they never knew was possible. Every ounce of guilt, regret, and despair poured out of them in an overwhelming wave. It felt like they were being torn apart from the inside out, the pain so intense it was almost physical. The officers tried to calm them, but it was impossible. They felt as if the world was closing in, suffocating them with the realization that they had played a part in this. Their actions had led to this tragic moment. Emergency responders arrived shortly after, attempting to sedate them, to bring some semblance of calm to the chaos inside their mind. But nothing could stop the spiraling panic, the unbearable knowledge that Daniel was gone and that it was their fault. In that moment, the world no longer made sense. Time seemed to freeze, and the reality of their choices hit with such brutal force that they couldn't grasp onto anything, couldn't hold on to anything at all. The days that followed were a blur of disbelief and numbness. The world seemed to lose all color, as if the very act of losing Daniel had drained it of everything that had once brought life and meaning. The narrator was consumed by a profound sense of emptiness, an all-encompassing void that they couldn't escape. No matter how hard they tried to keep busy, to pretend everything was fine, it was impossible to shake the truth that Daniel was gone, and they had played a central role in that devastating reality. In the days after receiving the news of Daniel's death, the grief was suffocating, unbearable. Each moment felt like an eternity, the silence in their home deafening. There was no more laughter, no more warmth, no more shared plans for the future. Everything had been stolen in an instant. The narrator found themselves staring at their phone, hoping in vain for a call or a message from Daniel. But nothing came. There was only an empty screen and a relentless reminder of the silence between them. It wasn't long before the cruel reality of their actions hit them in waves. They had betrayed Daniel's trust, and now he was gone. The thought of what he must have gone through in those final moments, how alone he must have felt, how broken his heart must have been, was almost too much to bear. The guilt of knowing they had broken the man who had once been their best friend, their confidant, their soulmate, was overwhelming. They couldn't escape the image of Daniel walking out, the coldness in his eyes, the silence in his departure. They couldn't stop imagining how that final confrontation might have played out in his mind, how much pain their betrayal had caused him. Then came the devastating realization that they would never get the chance to make amends, to tell Daniel how deeply sorry they were, how much they regretted the path they had taken. The funeral was a painful reminder of this irrevocable truth. The narrator wasn't allowed to attend. Daniel's family, understandably shattered by the loss, had made it clear that they didn't want the narrator there. The grief they felt, combined with the knowledge that their presence might only cause more hurt, was too much for Daniel's family to bear. The narrator's attempts to find out where Daniel was buried were met with cold resistance. His family had kept the details private, not wanting the narrator to be a part of any of it. They didn't deserve the chance to say goodbye. The narrator understood, but it didn't make the pain any less real. The void felt like it was growing wider every day, the absence of Daniel in their life becoming more and more unbearable. They were left with nothing but memories of a life they had ruined. In the weeks that followed, the narrator struggled to hold on to any semblance of sanity. The weight of what they had done seemed too much to carry, and their guilt became like a shadow, always looming, always present. The pain was so intense that the narrator began to contemplate the idea of joining Daniel, believing for a moment that perhaps the only way to escape the endless ache in their chest was to be with him again, even if it meant in death. Twice they tried to take their own life, each time only to be stopped by a moment of clarity, or perhaps by the realization that they still had a chance to live with the consequences of their actions, however painful it might be. But even as they were hospitalized and sedated in an attempt to bring some relief to their overwhelming despair, the darkness never fully receded. Every day felt like a battle, a fight to get through the next minute, the next hour, without succumbing to the weight of regret and loss. The psychiatrist told them that it would take time to process, time to heal, but in the narrator's heart, they knew that healing might never come. They had lost something far too precious to ever truly recover from it. The thought of what Daniel might have been, what they could have built together, was a constant, nagging ache in their soul. The absence of Daniel was not just a loss of love, it was the loss of the future they had envisioned, the life they had planned to share. Their marriage, once full of hope and joy, had ended in the most painful way possible. It wasn't just a relationship that had been destroyed. It was a vision of a life that had been taken from them. The narrator's survival, though a sign of physical life, felt like a form of punishment, a constant reminder of the damage they had inflicted. There were no answers, no ways to undo the pain. The only thing left for the narrator was to live with the consequences of their choices, to reflect on the devastation they had caused, not only to Daniel, but to themselves. They were left with a haunting question: could anything ever atone for the pain they had caused? As the weeks turned into months, the narrator found themselves trapped in a spiral of remorse, unable to escape the crushing weight of guilt that had settled deep in their chest. There were moments, quiet and still, when the full gravity of what had happened would hit them with such force that it almost felt like a physical blow. They couldn't stop replaying the sequence of events: the affair, the betrayal, the confrontation with Daniel, his departure, and then the devastating news of his death. It was as if time itself had slowed down, and they could see every decision they made, every word spoken, every action taken, that had led to this tragic ending. They could see their failure with heartbreaking clarity, and it was impossible to look away from the consequences. In the beginning, the narrator had tried to deny the connection between their actions and Daniel's death. They had convinced themselves that the reasons behind his suicide were more complicated than just the affair, that there were other factors at play, things they couldn't possibly know. But as the weeks dragged on, the narrative they had built for themselves began to crumble. They couldn't avoid the truth any longer. Daniel's death wasn't just some random tragedy. It was the direct result of their betrayal. They had torn apart the man who loved them, who had given them everything, and who had trusted them with his heart. And now, he was gone, leaving behind nothing but a permanent void in their life. The more the narrator thought about it, the more they understood how deeply their actions had cut Daniel. He wasn't just heartbroken over a fleeting affair. He had been shattered in a way they couldn't have imagined. The affair wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a simple mistake. It had been a profound betrayal of the foundation of trust they had built together over years. They had broken the very thing that had held them together, and in doing so, they had destroyed the man who had been their rock, their partner, and their best friend. The more the narrator reflected, the more they realized that the affair wasn't just about infidelity. It was about emotional abandonment. Daniel had been left alone in a relationship that should have been a safe haven. He had been left to process feelings of inadequacy, betrayal, and deep emotional pain without the support of the one person he trusted the most. The realization that they had let him down in this way, that they had turned away from him and found comfort in someone else, made the guilt even more unbearable. Daniel had deserved better. He had deserved the honesty, the loyalty, and the respect that they had promised him when they first said, "I do." But now, all that was left were the echoes of their broken promises and the knowledge that they had done irreparable harm. The affair had not only shattered their marriage, but it had also shattered Daniel's very will to live. They had to confront the painful truth. If they had never betrayed him, if they had never allowed their emotional needs to override the sanctity of their relationship, maybe, just maybe, Daniel would still be here. And that thought was the hardest to bear. The absence of a suicide note from Daniel seemed almost symbolic, as if his decision to end his life didn't need an explanation. It had been made clear in the destruction of their marriage, in the collapse of everything they had once been. For the narrator, the silence of that absence was deafening. They couldn't help but wonder if Daniel had given up hope, not just on their relationship, but on himself. Had they been the final straw, the breaking point that caused him to believe he couldn't go on? The realization was gut-wrenching. The love they had shared, the life they had planned, was no longer possible. The narrator had destroyed it all with their own hands. Every dream they had once shared with Daniel, every plan, every promise, had vanished in the wake of their selfish choices. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that the love of their life had been taken from them, not by fate, but by their own actions. The narrator couldn't forgive themselves. They couldn't undo what they had done, and no amount of regret or sorrow could change the outcome. They understood now that their survival, the fact that they were still alive, was a constant reminder of the devastation they had caused. The pain of knowing they had taken everything from Daniel, and in turn, taken everything from themselves, was unbearable. There was no way to undo the damage. There was no way to bring him back. And in the deepest corners of their heart, they knew that they would never be able to make things right. They longed for a chance to apologize, to tell Daniel how sorry they were, but they would never get that opportunity. The space between them was infinite now, too wide to bridge. The guilt that plagued them was unrelenting, and it would follow them for the rest of their life, a shadow they could never outrun. And as much as they wished for a chance to turn back time, they knew that the past could never be rewritten. They could never go back to the days when things had been simple, when Daniel had been alive, and their love had felt unshakable. Those days were gone, lost forever in the wake of their choices. The reality of their actions continued to haunt the narrator with every passing day. There was no escape from the searing guilt that took up residence in their mind, a constant reminder of what had been lost, of the pain they had caused Daniel, and of the irrevocable nature of his death. Despite the passage of time, the narrator found no peace. Every moment they spent alone, every quiet evening when they tried to distract themselves, only brought a sharper, more painful reminder of their betrayal. The life they had once shared with Daniel was now reduced to memories. Memories that were both a source of agony and a reminder of what they could never reclaim. What tormented the narrator the most, however, was the understanding that they would never have the chance to make things right, to seek Daniel's forgiveness, or to tell him how deeply they regretted the choices they had made. They could never go back to the moments before the affair, before the damage was done. The relationship, which had once been built on years of trust and shared dreams, was now irreparably broken. The guilt of knowing that they had betrayed Daniel in the most intimate and devastating way gnawed at them daily. And the more they reflected on their actions, the more they realized how incredibly foolish and selfish they had been. They thought back to their marriage, to all the ways in which they had taken Daniel for granted. He had been their partner, their confidant, their best friend. Together, they had created a future, a life they had both looked forward to. They had talked about having children, buying a house, growing old together. Those dreams had once felt so tangible, so within reach. But now those plans were nothing more than echoes in the corridors of their mind, hollow and unreachable. The narrator couldn't help but wonder what might have been if they had stayed true to their vows, if they hadn't allowed themselves to stray. How different would things be if they had simply communicated with Daniel, shared their concerns, or fought for their marriage instead of sabotaging it with an affair? But that opportunity was gone. Daniel was gone, and the chance to heal the relationship, to ask for forgiveness and begin to rebuild what they had lost, was no longer an option. The narrator couldn't help but feel that they had failed him in every way imaginable. Even now, knowing that they would never have the chance to tell Daniel how deeply sorry they were, they couldn't help but imagine what it might have been like if they had been given one more moment with him. One more chance to express their regret, to ask him to forgive them. But the moment had passed, and the weight of that lost opportunity was unbearable. The cruelest part of this realization was that the very thing that had driven them to seek out the affair in the first place, emotional distance, a desire for something more, something new, was now the thing that had left them empty, stripped of everything that had once given their life meaning. They had wanted, to feel desired, but in doing so, they had lost the one person who had truly loved them. Daniel had been their one true love, their soulmate. Now all they had were the remnants of their once shared life and the profound, crushing regret that they would never get the chance to tell him how sorry they were. In the aftermath of Daniel's death, the narrator found themselves paralyzed with a deep sense of powerlessness. They could never undo what they had done. They could never erase the hurt they had caused, and that knowledge was more suffocating than any other. Their attempts to make amends, through calls, through texts, through emails, had been in vain. The silence that greeted their desperate outreach only amplified the sense of abandonment. They had tried, but it was too late. The damage had already been done, and no amount of words could undo the pain they had inflicted. As they reflected on their lost opportunity for redemption, the narrator realized that they would carry this regret with them for the rest of their life. They would never be able to forget what they had done to Daniel. They would never be able to forgive themselves. Every milestone, every moment of happiness in their life would be tinged with the knowledge that they had lost the one person who had meant everything to them. Their survival, their ability to keep going felt like an endless punishment, a constant reminder that they had destroyed the person they loved most, and that love would never be enough to undo the devastation they had caused. The narrator couldn't help but wonder if they could ever find peace with themselves. Could they learn to live with the regret, to carry the weight of their betrayal without allowing it to completely destroy them? And would they ever be able to forgive themselves for taking away Daniel's chance at happiness, for making choices that led to his tragic end? The future felt uncertain, full of shadows and unanswered questions. The chance to make things right had slipped through their fingers, and all they were left with was a lifetime of silence, regret, and the burden of knowing they had caused irreparable harm.